Guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. I feel like the angle that I'm filming today is a little bit weird, but no matter how many times I mess with my camera, I cannot figure out an angle that I like. So we're just gonna go with this. Today we are going to be talking about a case that I'm sure many of you have heard before. Probably actually all of you might have heard of this case before, because today we're going to be talking about Jim Jones, Jonestown, and the People's Temple. Now I know that this case is very highly talked about, and on this channel I usually try and stay away from cases that are too highly publicized. However, I think that cults and things of that kind are absolutely fascinating, although sickening, and Jim Jones and the People's Temple is just something that I've always been really interested in, and so I decided, what the heck, I'm gonna do it anyway. So with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. Like I already said, this case is absolutely huge, and I'm sure many of you know a lot of information about this specific case, and I could have probably researched this for way longer than I did, and I could probably sit here and talk about this specific topic for hours, but I'm going to try and sum it all up without missing any important points into a shorter video. I guess it's probably going to be a longer video for me, but it's not going to be like 3 hours long, is what I'm kind of getting at. But anyways, if you're anything like me, then you are absolutely fascinated by cults, but what you're really interested in is people like Jim Jones and what makes them tick. And so I'm going to kind of start off by focusing on Jim Jones himself, and then I'll be talking about the People's Temple and the unfortunate tragedy that happened at the end of this case. Jim Jones was born on May 13th, 1931, and his birth name was James Warren Jones, but it got switched up and he is now known as Jim Jones. He was born to his parents Lynetta Putman and his dad Jim Jones Sr. Jim Jones was born and raised in Indiana, and his father, Jim Jones Sr., was a disabled veteran who was 15 years older than his mother. His mother and his father definitely did not have a great relationship. His father was, again, a disabled veteran, and he was away for work a lot, leaving Jim Jones and his mother alone very often. But on top of that, Jim Jones' mother did not want children. She voiced this very often while she was pregnant, during her pregnancy, and then afterwards, even once Jim was already born, she would just talk about how much she hated being a parent. She didn't want to be a parent. It was not her thing. She drank very heavily, and the couple's relationship just wasn't great. And they were both kind of big drinkers, and so Jim Jones just didn't really have too many concrete parent figures. They were both just kind of very absent in his life. Again, this family life just wasn't great. Both parents were heavy drinkers. They didn't want kids, but they ended up with a son, and it was just an absolute disaster. But that was not the only hardship that this family would face. Shortly after the birth of his son, Jim Jones Sr. fell under some kind of very ill state. He had some kind of accident that made him completely unable to work. And so because of this, the family's financial state dropped so low that Jim Jones Sr., his wife, and his son, all three of them, ended up being homeless for a period of time before Jim Jones Sr.'s family took the three of them in Lynn, Indiana. Majority of the people who were living in Lynn at that time were very, very religious. This was a very religious community. Everybody was avid churchgoers, and they just really had a very large church presence in that community. But something else that I feel like I need to mention is that there was also a kind of like large presence of the KKK within that community, and this is not confirmed. However, Jim Jones himself did say this at one point, that Jim Jones Sr. was a part of the Ku Klux Klan. So after moving to Lynn, again, his father could no longer work, so he kind of just stayed home. He became an alcoholic. He was always angry and just not a pleasant person to be around. And on top of that, Jim's mother had decided to get a job in a factory, and she sent young Jim to school at the age of 6 years old. So around that time, Jim started to spend a lot of time on his own because his mother was often at work, working these strange hours constantly, and he didn't want to go home and hang out with his dad because his dad was just an absolutely miserable man. So when he was done school, Jim would just kind of walk around the neighborhood. And because of this, a lot of the women who had kids of their own or didn't felt bad for Jim, and they would bring him into their house and they would give him sweets and just kind of let him hang out there, and kind of almost played like the motherly role in Jim's life because they did feel so bad for him. He was only 6 years old. He spent a lot of time by himself, and it just didn't seem like he had too much of a parent figure. So a lot of these women would step in and try and kind of give him that role. One of these women Jim had particularly taken a liking to, and he started to spend a lot of time with her. She was an elderly woman, and I believe she didn't have any children of her own, and she wasn't married or anything like that. And he had taken a particular liking to her, and she had started taking Jim with her to church. Now, immediately after attending church, Jim really liked this kind of environment. He really liked how people were kind of projecting positivity, and it just seemed like a nice environment that he really enjoyed. Now, before moving on from talking about young Jim Jones, I do just want to mention that while growing up, it was said that Jim Jones was a pretty quiet child, and a lot of the other kids and whatnot did think that there was something a little bit strange about him. But he wasn't a troublemaker. He really didn't get into too much trouble ever. He never really caused much of a problem, not at school, not in his community, nothing like that, which I think is a little bit different in these kinds of cases. Going to church was something that Jim Jones had carried with him for his entire life after starting to go at that young age. However, something that has brought up quite often is a lot of people didn't think that Jim Jones actually was religious. Many people have actually speculated that he possibly was atheist, but he just liked the community that the church had. So anyways, he was again really into the church. So after graduating from university where he got a teaching degree, that is when Jim Jones decided to join the ministry in Indianapolis, Indiana in the 50s and 60s. After that, Jim Jones quickly became well known in his community as a very vocal church man, and that is what he was known for, and he did do some good things. So he was very outspoken for, or I guess against, racism, which was not a big thing at the time. Many people didn't really join people of color together in a church. It wasn't really much of a mix. There wasn't white people and black people and all these people mixed together. It was kind of a separate thing, but Jim Jones really didn't like that. He wanted to bring everybody together, which is obviously something that is very good that he did believe. In 1955 is when Jim Jones would kind of establish a church of his own. It was a Pentecostal church, and at first it was called Wings of Deliverance, but that name would later change to the People's Temple. Now, when Jim had first really established this church, he was well known in the community for really helping out homeless people. So as you can see from what I'm telling you right now, it almost seemed like he had the right idea, but he just was insane. I don't really know how it progressed from having the right idea to what ended up happening within this community, but he did seem like he did have some very good ideas. It just seemed that eventually he kind of lost his mind and things happened that weren't great. By 1965, Jim Jones had believed that there was going to be some kind of nuclear war within Indiana, and so because of this, he kind of picked himself up and he moved to California. Now, by the time that he had moved to California, he already had quite a bit of a following, and he was actually starting to be referred to as the prophet because people who really believed in Jim Jones really strongly did believe in him. And like I was saying before, he did seem to have some of the right ideas, so I can understand how you would kind of fall in line with something like that. But in the end, he does end up being a very, very sick man. Track here just a little bit because I somehow missed a kind of important piece of information. So in 1949, Jim Jones actually ended up getting married to a woman by the name of Marcel Baldwin. Now, the two of them were married and they went on to have several children. Some of these children were biologically Jim's and Marcelin's. However, some of these children were also adopted. So they had adopted an African American son, they had adopted an American Asian daughter and an American Asian son, and then they had a biological child of their very own. And Jim referred to this kind of mix of children and him and his wife as the Rainbow Family. So let's kind of recap right now what we've already gone through that is important. So in 1955, Jim Jones started his very own church, which is called the People's Temple. This temple had a lot of following, and a lot of the members of this temple were of African American descent, because that seemed to be where Jim put a lot of his attention. He really spoke out against racism, and he really did a lot of work for the homeless, and was just making himself look like a very overall good man. And his entire, I guess, like look on life and what he really wanted to do, or what he was saying he really wanted to do, was bring everybody together. After Jim Jones had moved the church to California is when people started to speak out against Jim, saying that maybe he wasn't doing so many nice things, or he wasn't as nice as a person as everybody had thought. People started to accuse Jim Jones of financial fraud. He was also accused of abusing many of the members of the People's Temple, and he was also accused of not treating the children who were a part of his church very well at all. But despite these accusations, the People's Temple just kept growing, and once they moved to California, they had over thousands of members, and they now had 3 separate locations. Once they moved to California, after all of this craziness started to happen, is when Jim Jones would start speaking out against Christianity. So at first he was kind of speaking for it, but now he was speaking against it. He said that this was kind of racist, and it was kind of picking people and then picking on them, and he was saying that the Christianity, the entire religion, was just about singling people out and making them feel horrible. So obviously many people did not agree with what Jim Jones was saying, but many people thought that he was right, and so this actually helped him grow his church yet again, and he ended up with even more members. And of course, Jim loved the power. He loved people listening to him, and he wanted to keep growing the People's Temple. And so he bought a bunch of broken down buses, and he fixed them all up, and he would fill those buses with as many followers of his own that he could fit in the buses, and they would travel across America and kind of preach his religion, and they would recruit more people to join the People's Temple. Now that wasn't the only thing that was going on at this time. A lot of the people that Jim Jones had been recruiting into the People's Temple were older, and because of this, they needed to be taken care of, and so Jim offered to do that for them. However, in order for them to kind of let Jim take care of them, he convinced them to start selling off all of their valuable personal belongings. This included their homes, and once they did this, they were to give all of the money to the church. Jim Jones was a very persuasive man, and because of this, many people had decided to listen to him. They sold their homes, they sold a lot of their personal belongings, and then Jim moved them all into, I guess, like one house or several houses that he owned, and they were owned by the church. And now there were so many people living together that Jim needed people to constantly take care of these older people. So then he got people within the church to volunteer. However, this part gets confusing because the volunteers were being paid. However, whatever money they were being paid, Jim would kind of persuade them to give that money back to the church as well. So they were working hours and hours and hours, sometimes without sleep, just doing things that Jim had asked of them, and they were making absolutely no money because any penny that they made went back into the church. But again, people really believed in Jim Jones. He seemed like he was doing several good things, and he had even, I guess, like convinced many of these people that he had out of this world healing powers. And because of this kind of stuff, people really started to see Jim Jones as a kind of godlike figure. There are several videos that you can find on YouTube, and I will try and insert some of them in here without getting copyrighted, but these videos are of Jim Jones allegedly healing people. And one of these videos that kind of stands out to me in particularly is this older woman is having trouble walking, and Jim kind of says all this stuff, and he allegedly healed this woman, and then she was able to walk just fine, just completely normally without any issues. And that was kind of showing people that Jim did have these healing powers. But many of the things that he was healing people of were things like headaches, stomach aches, back pain, achy bones, achy, things like that you couldn't see it physically. So when Jim had said that he had healed these people and these people were then acting healed, a lot of people did strongly believe him. But as you have probably guessed, it did come out way later, way after all of this had happened, that none of these healings were real. I guess Jim was kind of hiring or asking people to kind of act for him, and they would do that. And in many of these cases, Jim had drugged these people, and they were so drugged and out of it that they had actually believed that whatever Jim was telling them was wrong with them was actually wrong with them. And so when Jim would tell them that he had healed them, they believed that they were then healed of something that they never had, which is just absolutely insane. While researching this case, it just really seemed to me that every single time the People's Temple grew, Jim Jones wanted to do something more extreme. So he started with these healings and all of this kind of crazy stuff. At one point he claimed that everybody besides himself was gay, so women were only actually interested in other women, and men were only interested in other men, but he was allowed to be interested in whoever he wanted. So a lot of these claims were just absolutely, like, they didn't even make any sense. But a lot of the people who were in the People's Temple were so blinded because Jim Jones seemed to have a few things that were good about him that they completely got lost in that and didn't even realize how outlandish a lot of these claims were. But now that we kind of talked about all of that, I want to get into the more intense stuff in this case. So I'm sure a phrase that many of us have heard before is "don't drink the Kool-Aid," which is kind of what people say to you when somebody else is feeding you bullshit. And that phrase came from this case. At this time, Jim Jones started to become very paranoid, and he was so paranoid at this point that he thought that the government would want to take him out. He was making several changes, he was bringing people together, and he thought that maybe the government didn't like this and they were going to try and get rid of him. On top of that paranoia though, Jim Jones started to take drugs. Now he said he was taking these drugs kind of self-medicating because he had a kidney issue, but obviously if you're taking drugs that are not prescribed to you, there is a high chance that these drugs can make you even more paranoid, so that just kind of added to his already not great mental state. One day, all of the members of the People's Temple were together, and Jim Jones started handing out Kool-Aid, and he was standing kind of talking to everybody, and once he had noticed that they had all started to drink their Kool-Aid, that is when he told them that the Kool-Aid had been poisoned. People in the People's Temple started freaking out because he was telling them he'd poisoned their Kool-Aid because he would rather them all go together than the CIA get anybody from his temple. After sharing this information, he then went back and told everybody that he hadn't actually poisoned the lemonade, or the Kool-Aid, sorry, and that he was just kind of like testing their loyalty to him, which is crazy. But this is kind of what really started to make a lot of people within the church notice that something within the People's Temple was not right. Again, at this time, Jim Jones was extremely paranoid. He was abusing his church members. He was taking money from them. He was doing all of these things that were just absolutely horrible. And that is when one of the members of the People's Temple had decided to kind of help write an article on Jim Jones about all of the horrible things that he was doing to the people within the People's Temple. And once Jim Jones kind of got wind that this article was going to be published, that is when he really went over the edge. When Jim had heard that this article was going to be made public, that is again what really set him over the edge, and he just decided nope, he didn't want the government coming after him, he didn't want all of this bad publicity, and so he was just going to pack up all of the People's Temple and anybody who was a part of his church, and he was going to move them all to Guyana. So Jim Jones bought some land in Guyana, and on December of 1975, he packed up a few of his cult members with him, and they went to Guyana, and that is where they started building what would be their very own community. I believe the original amount of people who went to Jonestown with Jim Jones and kind of helped him build it and then remained living there was about 90, and this first group of people started to send letters and pictures and videos telling the other members of the People's Temple how great it was in this little community that they had made and how happy they were living in Jonestown, and just really trying to convince them to move there as well. And this ended up working. I believe 500 more people moved to Jonestown, and they were all there. But after they all moved there, that is when rumors started to circulate that Jim Jones was abusing his power like he was doing before he had even moved to Guyana. And he was really blackmailing the members of the People's Temple, and kind of brainwashing them into staying in Guyana with him when they really didn't want to. And after they moved to Jonestown in Guyana, the People's Temple just kept growing. Jim Jones had this very electric personality that just drew people into him, and even though he was doing all of this crazy stuff, people still really strongly believed in him. So even after he had picked up an entire community of people and moved them to Guyana, the group just kept growing. And it wasn't good. Rumors that were coming out of this place were horrible, and in 1977, an ex-member of the People's Temple was trying to get an investigation open into Jim Jones because there were allegations that he was really abusing his members, which we already knew. He was taking money from them. He was doing all this crazy stuff. There was even an allegation that he had raped at least one woman within the People's Temple. But despite all of this, a lot of the people who were in the People's Temple still really believed in Jim Jones. By 1978, the People's Temple and Jonestown had reached its absolute peak with about 900 members total, all living together in Guyana in Jonestown. And you'd think because the church just kept growing and growing that these people would be happy, but many of the members weren't, and a lot of them wanted to leave, but Jim Jones was having none of it. He really wouldn't let them. And in Jonestown, they had absolutely whatever you needed, so the members really didn't even have any kind of excuse to leave that little community that they were living in. Many of the ex-members were going to the American government and trying to get them to open an investigation and to really go investigate Jim Jones and what he was doing in Guyana. And so in November of 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan decided that he wanted to go to Jonestown his very own self and see what was actually going on there, and if people that were living there were happy or if they were being held there against their will, or what really was going on. And when Jim Jones heard that Congressman Ryan was coming to Jonestown, he absolutely freaked out. He was trying to find a way to not let the congressman in. He was doing all of these crazy things and having all of these crazy ideas because this just really, he didn't want to do this. He didn't want them coming into his property. He didn't want them coming into the church or the Jonestown. He wanted them to have nothing to do with it and just leave him and his people alone. On November 17th, 1978, Congressman Ryan, NBC News, a lot of the reporters and the cameramen and stuff like that went with him, as well as some of the family members of the people who were living in Jonestown, all went to Jonestown to kind of see what was up and what was going on. And Jim Jones welcomed them with open arms despite the fact that he did not want them there. He had kind of like a party for them. There was music and dancers and everybody seemed really happy. There was music playing and it just seemed like a great environment. He had even told the members of the People's Temple to put on this act because he didn't want anybody leaving and he didn't want any investigation opened up into him. So although everybody was looking like they were having a great time, many of the members of the People's Temple were slipping notes to the congressman, to family members, to NBC reporters, whoever they could. They were slipping them notes saying, you know, help us out, we don't want to be here, we're here against our will, things along of those lines, which just really struck everybody and made them take a step back because obviously something horrible was going on here. After receiving these notes, that is when the congressman had decided to confront Jim Jones about what his members were saying. And Jim Jones really brushed this off. He said that these people were basically lying, they were just looking for attention, and that if they wanted to leave, they could. And this is where this case takes an absolute turn for the worst. When it came time for Congressman Leo Ryan to leave Guyana, he was accompanied back to his plane by some of the members of the People's Temple. When they had arrived back at the plane, that is when some of the members of the People's Temple started holding open fire on the people that were trying to leave. They ended up shooting Leo Ryan, NBC reporter Don Harris, cameraman Bob Brown, and a photographer named Greg Robinson, along with one of the members of the church. And all of them sadly ended up losing their lives to these gunshot wounds that again were inflicted by members of the People's Temple. So obviously these orders to shoot the congressman and the NBC reporters and whoever was given by Jim Jones to the members of the People's Temple who had accompanied them back to the plane. But when news got back to Jim Jones about what had happened, that is when absolute mayhem set in. He stood up in front of all of the members of the People's Temple in Jonestown and told them that basically the government wanted them dead and that they were going to come and kill them, but he didn't want that, and he wanted them all to die together and basically commit mass suicide. That is when Jim Jones started passing around to all of the members of the People's Temple grape Kool-Aid, and this grape Kool-Aid had been laced with cyanide. At this point, a lot of the people who were within the People's Temple did not want to drink the Kool-Aid. They did not want to die, and they didn't believe in what Jim Jones was saying. And so one of these women stood up and kind of spoke out, saying that she didn't want to die, she didn't want to watch her children die, and that she was leaving Jonestown. But unfortunately, that didn't end up happening because Jim then directed the guards over to her and she was shot dead right there on the spot. As you can tell by that, Jim really wasn't giving the members any kind of option. They were either going to drink the Kool-Aid or they were going to pass away in some other manner. And so a lot of the people did start drinking the Kool-Aid, and there were just people dropping dead everywhere. And this included women and children of all ages. And while this was all going on, that is when Jim Jones shot himself in the head, committing suicide his very self. Sadly, 909 people lost their lives that day in Jonestown. Many of these people had tried to escape, but sadly, only 5 of these people were able to do so. This case is just absolutely heartbreaking and so difficult to wrap your mind around, and it is so upsetting that so many people ended up losing their lives because of this one very sick man. But guys, that brings us to the end of today's video. I have been filming forever, so I think that this is going to be a long one, but if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!